Shadow work is talked about a lot on the spiritual path, but having seen what we've seen come out of our spiritual leadership in the last several months, we can see that it's rarely been done truly and honestly. And so I think this is something we need to talk a lot more about, the way that shadow work, shadow integration shows up in spiritual practice and the way that we might engage with it. But before I get into deep on those aspects of things, I want to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from in relation to this stuff, because I am not some sort of perfected teacher. I teach yoga, I engage with spirituality, and I share my experiences, but I'm not someone who has achieved some sort of perfect shadow integration. I haven't arrived at any place to speak of. And right now, actually, it's the perfect time for me to talk about this because I'm in the thick of it. I'm showing up in a way in my life right now which doesn't feel like something I want to be proud of. I'm grieving for having to leave my partner and my home and my animal companions on the other side of the world and move back in with my parents. And I'm feeling really fractured inside. I notice that I'm angrier. I notice that I'm sad a lot. I notice that I'm not necessarily containing those emotions in a way that's comfortable for the people around me. And while I think it's important that we do express these things and we do have a sense of allowing for our own process, there is also the aspect of compassion for people around us and, showing up in a way that doesn't cause greater suffering for those that we live with and see day to day. And so I don't think I'm doing that very well right now. I do feel at times overpowered by my emotions and just too exhausted, really, to put on any kind of a presentation. And I think this presentation, this idea that, the spiritual self appears in a certain way, is one of the reasons why culturally we've gotten into such a pickle when it comes to spiritual leadership. Because the presentation of calm, harmonious, unaffected, emotionally neutral selves is not the reality of human experience, no matter how practiced we are spiritually. And certainly, perhaps there are people in the world who genuinely experience that level of harmony, which is able to show up as a perfect container for others. But I haven't personally met them. I don't experience my own process like that. And most of my spiritual teachers, the ones who have guided me along my path, have said very explicitly that they get overwhelmed, get overpowered by their internal experience sometimes, and they show up in ways that they're not proud of. So this is me, offering my thoughts and ideas on this topic with a full acknowledgement and recognition that I am not an expert and I do not know how to walk this path in the right way. And I don't think there is a right way. But this is all a part of shadow work, right? The recognition that I am not going to be perfect all of the time. When it comes to non-violence, the reality of being a human being on this earth at this point in history is that there is no avoiding the fact that we are violent. Just my existence in this nation of Australia, which has been founded on a colonial project, means that my presence is displacing and micro-traumatizing to Indigenous folks that I encounter. Just my very presence in a world where I'm so privileged to be able to turn on the tap and get running water immediately, or go to the shop and buy healthy, nourishing food. is founded on the idea that there are millions of people in this world whose labor contribute to my privilege here and now. So ahimsa, the yogic idea of nonviolence, is something that we can practice and we can work towards, but it's not something we can actually perfect. And integrating shadow means recognizing that actually, as much as I long for a full expression of ahimsa, the reality is that I will cause harm at some point in some way, regardless of how well intentioned my practice might be. And likewise, being able to look at my own behavior at this point in time in my life and to see, wow, yeah, my grief and my anger is bleeding out. And I am doing what I can as I can through this process, and certainly there's going to be a huge integration around this for me in the coming months. I can see there's still the fact that from day to day right now, I'm not showing up in the best possible way. And that's a reality. And that is a reality of most of the spiritual teachers that you'll encounter. They have their own personal lives. They have their own experiences of grief, fear, shame, anger, challenge that they encounter, which sparks emotions in them. It sparks behavior patterns. It wakes up their sanskaras, their habitual ways of being, or their trauma that's been embodied. And so regardless of our relationship with them in our spiritual community and the way that that might come across, all of us are genuine, real human beings that are struggling to live on this earth in this plane that the Buddha identified as fundamentally founded on suffering. And while suffering isn't all that it is, we do, in order to integrate shadow, need to be honest with ourselves about where we're at. And so forcing things like non-attachment, which I spoke about in a recent video, or, forcing love and light at times when, if we're being authentic about our experience, isn't really what we're experiencing. It becomes a masking through spirituality or a bypassing of our reality of truth in order to feel better about ourselves through the spiritual. But spirituality, if we're addressing it from the traditional teachings, from, not from the New Age, neo-colonial interpretations of those teachings, but going back to source texts, we see that what it's all about is actually truth, not comfort. It's not necessarily about internal peace and harmony. It's about a collective reality of oneness. And that oneness collectively, to recognize others as ourselves, might mean some individual discomfort. So if we begin to look at the people who are oppressed by our privileged way of life as us, there is a great deal of discomfort in order to compassionately kind of envelope them into our experience of being. And it might ask us individually to start to step outside of our own kind of personalized peace and personalized harmony in order to treat them as ourselves. So this integration of shadow becomes much more complex, much more multidimensional than simply saying, oh, I had some hard experiences in childhood and they gave me particular patterns, and if I, shift those patterns and recognize them and integrate them, then I'll feel at peace. There's so many more layers to shadow work. Which kind of expands outward almost infinitely into our ability to accept all that is as one, as self, as I. And so we look at those people who are oppressed and we recognize that actually they are a limb of the same body being, that same unified consciousness that I am. and we begin to behave towards them in that way. But we also, and here is a deeply uncomfortable part, is begin to recognize those who we see as overt oppressors, maybe not just passive oppressors like our own privileged way of life, but, you know, the Donald Trumps of the world and the Elon Musks and the folks who kind of have these huge reservoirs of social and economic power, who are choosing to behave in ways which are actively creating suffering through conscious choice. They too are also us. They too are also a part of this one being. And so integrating that as shadow shifts our perspective further and creates even more individual discomfort, right? For us to actually metabolize that, we have to walk through a path of fire, of real kind of galvanizing our sense of integrity and recognizing the implications of what unity consciousness actually means. And it's only through this type of receptivity to unity as its truth, rather than just what we idealize it to be, this kind of like fuzzy, warm, harmonious sensation of always being at peace. It's only through that true integration that we can begin to act in the world. And of course, recognizing the villains as ourselves doesn't necessarily mean submitting to that behavior as if, you know, I don't have any responsibility now to do anything about it, because they are also oneness and divinity, and therefore, you know, I just accept that their behavior is what it is. Because a part of that oneness is also the people who take action to resist that type of oppression. And so we're containing all of these different roles within ourself in order to be able to compassionately understand why and how each of these roles might emerge in this material reality, this material world in which we're embodied, so that the action we choose to take with that compassionate heart, with that sense of unity, is one which is genuinely effective and genuinely oriented towards ahimsa, towards nonviolence. Not a perfecting of nonviolence, recognizing once again that we are going to cause harm at different stages of our lives in different ways, but that we're leaning towards that nonviolence in everything that we do, even the way that we might deal with people who harm us. And this is where my own shadow integration is really like coming into an uncomfortable place right now, because in my personal life, I'm coming up against a lot of sense of frustration with organizations that have a lot of power, with governmental organizations and organizations who own and operate AI and apps and technology and all of these things that are beginning to impact our lives, because we're being kind of forced through this neo-colonial capitalist system into a participation with things that we might otherwise choose not to participate with. And, you know, I'm finding it very difficult to really respond from that compassionate heart in some of these situations. And that's where I'm finding my frustration, my anger, even my rage, if I was to put the full extremity of that emotion to give it a label. Like, there is rage in me. And that too is a part of this unified consciousness, is a part of this expression of one being in its diversity. And so how do I metabolize the fact that this rage is also me? So all of this sort of layering of our shadow work, both in the internal embodied experience as an individual expression of divinity, of unity, as well as recognizing the seemingly external beings as ourselves requires quite a lot of presence and ongoing showing up for shadow integration that isn't one dimensional. It isn't limited to just those kind of harmony, happy, fuzzy feelings when we kind of realize a specific trauma activator from our youth or our own individual life, and then the lights go on and we understand it and it all falls into place, and then we feel better. Because sometimes, and not always, of course, that level of shadow work is really important as well, but sometimes the internal peace and the internal comfort is not necessarily a sign of an integrated shadow. Sometimes it's a sign of distancing ourselves from some of the deeper shadow work, which might ask us to step into a lack of comfort for a while, or a sense of resistance to reality. And so I guess this is an invitation for you all walking alongside me on this path, right? Because none of us are better than any other. And this is another kind of image or mythos that gets perpetuated in spiritual circles when it comes to shadow integration is the idea of shadow integration gives us a sense of timeline, like maybe I'll do this, and this, and then I'll be integrated, and then I'll arrive. And then once I've arrived, I can teach others how to do this. And then we end up with this guru system where folks are really no longer doing their shadow work, and their shadow is running rampant. And the kind of power that people can obtain through spiritual community, because so many of us are searching for guidance and care and support, that power can really become misused and abused, either consciously or unconsciously. Some folks do it unintentionally, but it's a part of our collective responsibility to kind of show up together in as human a way as we possibly can, and to walk alongside one another and keep each other accountable. So if there is unconscious misuse of power, we can kind of call each other in and go, hey, you know what? I just noticed this thing is happening and I'm curious about where that's coming from, and maybe we can sit down and reflect on that together, and, compassionately ask for that self-study, that svadhyaya, which is so important on the spiritual path. And of course, when there is a conscious, intentional abuse of power occurring, we can band together as community and make it really clear that actually that isn't what we want. And what we're looking for is an acknowledgement of shadow, real integrity in our ability to show up for where we've made mistakes, and to hold ourselves accountable for that, and to lean back into that truth of genuine unity, genuine oneness with all beings, which invites compassion. Thanks so much for listening today. If you enjoy the content that I'm putting forward on this channel, please like, subscribe, comment. It helps it get out to other folks who might also find value in it. And it also helps build my community, because if I'm really honest, I would love to actually connect with other people who are walking this it feels like, unfortunately, a very rare spiritual path nowadays that is able to acknowledge the material realities of the world equal to the spiritual realities, and see them as one and the same thing, rather than needing to separate them and kind of create a spiritual culture which removes itself from the human suffering, the politics, and the challenge that we are being faced with as humanity today. So yeah, I will see you around. Bye.